Pleasure to participate in this very topical and an important discussion. Even if the topic is gloomy, I hope we come home with some positive conclusions and way forwards. So my name is David Mahilayi. I'm a senior economist at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. I have a background in sort of macroeconomics and been working doing technical assistance, trainings, research on issues around how resource-rich countries manage their economic woes, whether that's managing volatility, building up sovereign wealth funds, or dealing with their debt problems, which is the topic of the day. So what I'm going to let me just start with a bit of additional framing, building on top of what we've heard. The way, as a data-oriented person, I have this plot which shows the IMF and the World Bank classify countries as in debt distress or in high risk of debt distress or low risks of debt distress. Well, you can debate whether those judgments are appropriate or not, but this is a plot which shows how the share of countries had changed that was marred being either in high risk of debt distress or already in debt experiencing that distress changed over time. And I took a snapshot in 2011. So that's 10 years ago. And then I took a snapshot not long ago, at the end of 2020. And this sort of shows the evolution in 10 years. And what you see is about half of the not resource-rich countries, this is only the low-income developing countries, but it goes beyond Africa. And it shows that the non-resource-rich countries, nearly half were in debt distress, and that's pretty much the same range as it was 10 years ago. But there's this big jump in some of the other countries, especially already you can see it in the resource-rich countries. Only 30% or so, 1 in 3 resource-rich country was in debt distress 10 years ago, and now it's more than half. And even more shocking, there's these countries that the IMF has labeled prospective resource producer or prospective resource exporters. These are countries that made big discoveries about 10 years ago. You can think of Tanzania and its gas discoveries, or Mozambique's gas discoveries, Ghana's new oil. You can think of Sierra Leone had made major iron ore discoveries at the time. And so did Liberia. So these are some of these countries that were labeled prospective, as in they were not historically that big resource. I mean, obviously all countries have exported resources, but they had made these sort of breakthrough discoveries that were imagined that they might propel countries to new riches. And this group of countries, there was a lot of optimism about them in that period. Very few of them had actually have high levels of debt, and they were seen as having very strong growth potential, and so low risks of debt distress. And what you see is now many of them are also in debt distress. So why am I bringing this slide up? Is just to say that while you would expect that countries that have a lot of resource, that have a lot of new potential, new discoveries, they are the ones that should be best placed to fight or to pay back their debt or avoid debt distress. They're not, and that's a big puzzle. And one answer to this puzzle is obviously that maybe some of these resource-rich countries, they're actually using their resource wealth to borrow. So it's because they have resources that they are able to go out and borrow more expensively. This is something Veronica was also alluding to in her own slides. This idea that because you have resources, you can go and get some dangerous debt, and then you will run into trouble. One particular type of debt that I was mostly interested in is this resource-backed loans. I'm sure most of you on the panel will be familiar, although, but maybe you've not seen the extent to which it's grabbing headlines in across all the world. And I'm going to talk to you about some research we did where we identified 30 resource-backed loans across 11 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa to the tune of 66 billion. We also looked at Latin America, by the way, but I'm only talking about the sub-Saharan African results now. And I mean, this 66 billion is a big number. It's about 10% of the debt stock of the continent. But the 11 countries is also quite big, although it does show you that it's pretty concentrated in some countries, and I'm going to talk to you more about it. The other thing that I noticed about these resource-backed loans is they make a lot of headlines. And they make so these are various headlines. You can see some of these loans that run into problems. So the Chad's Glencore loan was one. South Sudan was pushed to stop taking resource-backed loans by the IMF. Angola was negotiating hard with the Chinese on their resource-backed loans. So these are some of these stories around debt distress, really, where the problems emanate from these loans. You can also see new ideas of borrowing. So Guinea, quite recently, 2017 was when they agreed on the framework agreement in 2018, 2019. So they're basically just starting to draw down on this massive commitment from the Chinese to provide resource-backed loans to the Guinean. Now I'll have to say they only draw down $500 million. So it's not like they've taken all the 20 billion in debt. But still, that's sort of a new big commitment. Nigeria going into a new deal. What was that? Last year with Vitol, another energy trader. And then there's some very creative plans. The one that I'm showing in Ghana didn't actually materialize, although where the government of Ghana decided it may sell away its future gold royalties to investors on the London Stock Exchange. They later walked back that plan, and it's being revised now. And so but these are if you think about them and read about them more carefully, you realize that these are they're different types of loans. So I want to give you first a definition about what I call a resource-backed loan and what I don't call a resource-backed loan. And all of that is based on our report that we wrote with Jijong Huang, who's a researcher, PhD researcher. She was formerly with John Hopkins' SAIS, which is a research center on China and Africa. And Aisha Adam, former colleague of mine at now a PhD student as well. It's available in English and French from our website. So definition, and this is important because the more we started to look at the cases, the more we realized that various people use various definitions and various names for similar things. In a way, if you lend to a country that's rich in resources, obviously the investor might hope that those resources will help repay the loan. But we can't call every loan to Nigeria a resource-backed loan because that's not a very helpful definition. So we decided to narrow it and be more specific. And in our definition, we only look at loans to either the government or a state-owned enterprise, and that's important, where not everyone will agree with that. So government or state-owned enterprises, and then basically the repayment form could either be payment in kind, as in oil shipments. That's what we see, for example, in the Angola loans, that there's a payment in kind where there's a certain number of barrels of oil that they have to ship, or there's an income stream that's earmarked. They say, okay, every royalty proceed will go to that account, and that account will be used to repay the loan. Or they can have an asset that serves as collateral, and that's actually quite rare, where there's only, where they'd say that, if the loan is not being repaid, we can take a mining asset. And then we only care about the loans that are taken to finance something different than the revenue, than what generates the revenue stream itself. So if you take a loan to build an oil, say a mine, and the revenues from that mine will repay that mine, we don't consider it a resource-backed loan. We just call it project finance. If a government takes a loan that repays itself, then that's pretty normal, as in most of the oil industry will have sort of something called carry arrangements, where an investor says, yes, I can help you build a new mine or a new oil project, and let's make sure that the revenues from that specific project will repay the loan. So that we don't consider a resource-backed loan. What we consider a resource-backed loan is if you say, I'm going to build a housing project, or I'm going to build roads, and I'm going to use my mining revenues for that. Then we call it resource-backed loans. So that's just our definition. You can disagree with it, but we found it helpful in getting to a very specific type of loan that we see problematic, but also worth analyzing in more detail. And the report is rather long, and it walks through a lot of the pros and cons, and it also gives you a lot of examples on how these particular loans paid out in various countries. And I'm just going to talk you through the summary. I won't go through all the findings in detail, and I hope I find this table for myself at least very helpful, as it summarizes all the key takeaways from that long report. One big takeaway is I told you there's only, from the 52 African countries, or 48 in sub-Saharan Africa, only 11 took out resource-backed loans. And those tend to be countries with weaker resource governance. They also tend to be less transparent about their debt reporting, and especially opaque SOEs. Not all of them are opaque. For example, we use the Resource Governance Index to analyze which country is more or less transparent, and some countries are better performers than others, but the biggest borrowers on our list tend to report very little and have weaker governance arrangements. Chad, Republic of Congo, Angola were some of the weaker performers, especially these state-owned enterprises on that list, were weaker performers. I also note that since the report was published, already some of these SOEs are starting to put out. Also, the Jacomin, for example, DRC is a big borrower. They just put out their first annual report. So we see a movement here where even these companies are starting to clean up their act. Second thing I wanted to highlight from the report is this limited competition. It's not like you can go out, I don't know, to the streets of London or whatever and say, I want a resource-backed loan, and go all to the big banks, and all the big banks will provide you with resource-backed loans. There are very few actors that actually provide such arrangements. It's mainly the two Chinese export banks, Chinese development banks, so that's China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, are the main culprits, and then a handful of commodity traders that you're looking at. So it's not, if you had all the big banks, well, that would bring their own problems, but at least you could in theory try to organize some competition to get some better terms. That's not really what we see. We see basically companies that's one form in which there's few companies involved, and the other form there's limited competition is these companies often they're linked projects where you take a loan from China Exim Bank, and then you also commit to undertake some of the project, use the project proceeds to do infrastructure with another Chinese contractor that's linked. And maybe the oil project is also linked to a company. And so in that bundled way, you also have less competition. So that's another negative. Third is hidden terms. From the vast majority of the loans, we only got basically the loan size and the maturity. Interest rates, less than a third of cases where the interest rates on these loans. And at the time of the writing of the report, there was only one contract public. Since then, A few more contracts became public through a report called How China Lends, which uncovered Ecuadorian loan contract. And also we had major revelations through Eiti. I'm going to talk to you about it more in a second. Fourth big risk we identify is maybe some of these loans would be okay, but the amount of loans that some countries have taken on was just too much. So we see an overborrowing. Countries get hooked to resource-backed loans, and then they take more and more and more until sort of it becomes unsustainable. So there's this risk of overborrowing. And we show in the report that for some of these countries how it went from one loan to ballooning, and basically resource-backed loans being the main game in town. In a way, it can sort of squeeze out any other form of sort of conventional lending. And then we also see conflict across creditors. If one creditor has access to a resource, say in Zambia, or we've seen sort of this debate somewhat play out, but where one group of creditors, say in Angola, the Chinese loan or some Indian loan or whatever, is being repaid in oil, whereas say other traditional sort of Western financiers are only being paid back by the Ministry of Finance through cash, then in a way the oil payment will, even if the Ministry of Finance runs out of money, the oil-backed loan can still be repaid. In a way, it's more senior because they get the revenues before it hits the treasury. And so that creates a big conflict, basically, because if country goes into default, then the other creditors will ask, if my loan is already in default, then can't be repaid, why is that other oil-backed loan still being repaid? So that's the kind of conflict you can anticipate from these kind of loans. So I'll give you a lot of cons. Let me go through the pros as well. The pro is actually there's a lot of earmarking going on. Not all of them, but a lot of them have been earmarked specifically for infrastructure projects. And that's a good thing rather than the loan being consumed. Well, you can then debate whether the infrastructure was good or bad, whether it was a good choice, how the project was selected, whether it was the appropriate sector and all that. And we don't do that, and that's open for further debate and research. But at least it's earmarked for say infrastructure. And from what we could tell, most of the time, you can again debate on the price tag, but it's being built. The rates are often cheaper, especially cheaper if you compare to commercial loans. Most of these, again, it's dominated by these Chinese lender loans, and these Chinese resource-backed loans, they have interest rates of 2-3%. They have some fees, but still, and some are below 2%. They're much, much cheaper than going out and borrowing from the private sector. Obviously, they're not as cheap as, say, a concessional loan from a multilateral, from the African Development Bank. So it's more expensive than that. There's a positive feature where it can mitigate volatility. Some of these loans have a feature where you need to repay less when the prices are low, and that's a big advantage. You can repay quicker when the prices are high, and in times of crises. You can, if you only have to repay, say, 20,000 barrels a day, then that automatically builds in that kind of mechanism that it's 20,000 barrel. If the oil price is half what it was, it's only 20,000 barrel. Whereas if you had to repay in dollars and the oil price is half, then you would need double the amount of oil to repay it. So that's one way. It's a bit complicated, but you can go into the report to read it in more detail. The other thing, and it goes back to the lack of competition, one thing we observe is a lot of them are being renegotiated. And the reason we think that so many have been renegotiated, extended, and all that is because of this interdependence. The lender is in for the long run. There's multiple tied projects. So if there's a temporary difficulty, say a COVID shock or another shock, then it's much more likely they'll say, okay, let's extend the loan, let's defer some maturities, maybe even get the interest rate down. In many cases, we've seen that because we don't want to give up, a lucrative relationship from their point of view. So it can be renegotiated more easily than, say, with a bond where, the bondholder will say, I want to get the maximum out of this. I'm gonna fight this till the end. I'm gonna go to international courts and arbitration because the more I get out, the better for me, and that's the end of the game for them. So those are sort of the big conclusions that's come out of the policy report. I also wanted to touch a little bit about why I think, we have, and the report overall, it doesn't want to say do it or don't do it. It's more try to understand what are the pros and cons. And if you're doing it, and that the perspective I take is countries are doing it. Countries are still doing it. Countries will continue to do this, it looks like. So if we're doing it, how can we do it better? And I think a key critical part here is to get a better understanding and more transparency around these loans. And luckily, things are starting to move in that direction. So I guess there's a few moving pieces. One is on the lender side. On the lender's side, the IIF, Institute for International Finance, have put forward some guidelines on how they would encourage private sector lenders to report on their lending activities to developing countries, and in those it's going to be it's only starting to be implemented. The OECD will host their repository, and that repository on the OECD website has that template they provide has a specific category for resource-backed loans, basically. So in theory, one day, lenders that do decide to provide that kind of loan will be reporting, hopefully through these voluntary principles. Although I will note that the commodity traders that are the most active, they're not members of the IIF. So that's a big problem I see there. Is will even if it's voluntary, these commodity traders are not even part of the umbrella that would do that. So that's going to be a major fight to get that happen. Another problem I saw is the whole point or the big interest in our report was because the data on which loan is resource backed or not is not there. It's not publicly available from, most people would go maybe to the World Bank's website for debt statistics. They have the international debt statistics, which is very, very detailed. But there's no category you can ask, show me if there's a resource security or not. That information is just not in the reporting system. And most countries the same. If you have a debt management office in whatever, say, Sierra Leone, where I worked for a couple of years, there's no tick box where the debt management office can record this one is resource backed, this one's not resource backed, this one's resource backed. But the debt bank is making a big priority to have better reporting systems that hopefully will allow to track that kind of information. So at least governments have a way and to report, and then management offices can sort of track the evolution of this kind of loans. Finally, I want to mention EITI, the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative, which has been a treasure trove in terms of information on these loans. Many of the SOEs that are taking these loans do report in detail on the repayments of these loans. A major breakthrough in Guinea, where the ITI report has all the key terms, the interest rates, the fees, the repayment terms for the Guinean big bauxite loan. And finally, contracts. The DRC was the first to publish the Jacomin contracts. So that's a big copper-backed loan. And now we've seen further publication. We've seen sort of the major, the Ghanaian bauxite loan, also key documents that were published through a report called How China Lends. So we're seeing more and more places where you can see the actual loan contract. And I think that's going to be critical. As I said, so much these loans are very different in how they work. Some of them will have an escrow account, say an escrow account offshore. Others will have earmarks or other forms, and the legalities matter a lot. But we can only go into the legalities if you see the contract text. So going from disclosing, the key terms, like what's the interest rate, what's the repayment schedule like, to going to publishing the full debt contract text, I think that's going to be the frontier, and that's what we need to push if we want to really, really carefully evaluate whether a loan is a good deal or a bad deal. That's what I would encourage as sort of the next step in this arena. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope this was interesting, and I encourage, if any of you have more interest in the topic or want to discuss particular cases, actually, I'm very fascinated, and a lot of the report, what it builds on, is from discussions with specialists in country that know particular loans very well. So this is also a call for help. I'm continuing this line of work. So with NRGI. So if resource-backed loans are a big issue in your country, then do share now or do share later. Get in touch so that we can have a more careful understanding of what's happening at the individual country loan case level. Thank you so much.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Debt and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.